Joining us right now to talk about more on this particular issue we just discussed earlier is Veronika Poniscjakova from University of Portsmouth. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
All right, so we are looking at Chinese reaction to this communique just now, and it has garnered a lot of backlash from China. What do you think is the incentive from these NATO allies to now turn up the heat and turn up the language when it comes to dealing with China?
First of all, I would start by saying that the communique was quite a surprise. There were some very much expected points, including continued support for Ukraine and a very careful, cautious approach when it comes to Russia. But calling out China so openly for their continued support of Russia is very much unexpected. And the language, this very strong language used in the communique, I would say is quite unprecedented and is one of the biggest surprises of the NATO summit.
Right, so decisive enabler, that is what China has been called. And the response from China was that the West is sowing discontent. So do you think that this will have further repercussions?
I think it's very unlikely to expect China to back off. From China's perspective, they don't see anything wrong with their relationship, with Russia. They have been not supportive of Russia's endeavors in Ukraine, but they certainly have been enabling them, as the communique suggested. From China's perspective, the fact that they keep cooperating with Russia is only part of their grand vision. China wants to challenge the Western rules-based international system, rules-based international order, and cooperating with Russia and other hostile states of the Western world is just what they want to do.
Right, and I think this language that's being tuned up also points to the fact that the NATO and its allies are increasingly aware of the fact that Russia is building its alliance with countries like China, North Korea, Iran, kind of forming an axis. And do you think that that fact and kind of the newly aware NATO members and its allies will be able to also tune up the support to Ukraine in response to that possible threat building looming on the horizon?
First of all, I would say that the fact that we have these cooperation of hostile actors, something that I do like to label as axis of evil 2.0, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and also the so-called axis of resistance allied to Iran, they are becoming a problem. And that's why we see the current arrangements, defense arrangements and alliances being built to counter them. This is what we are seeing at the current NATO summit. The cooperation in the East Asia-Pacific region, on top of other existing alliances, whether it's AUKUS or Quad, all of these are to counter this influence. And, of course, continued support for Ukraine is part of that wider strategy of NATO as well.
Right. So what about these other countries, the allies of NATO countries, right, from the Indo-Pacific, as the representatives of these countries are also attending the summit? What about what our colleague has just mentioned, these new initiatives? Could you please expand on that?
First of all, cooperation between NATO and other states, there is nothing new. NATO has vital partnerships all around the world, but I think more emphasis on the East Asia-Pacific region is especially vital now, given rising influence of China. So I think what we can see in the next couple of years is increased cooperation and more joint exercises between NATO and these partners in the East Asia-Pacific region, and perhaps more cooperation in terms of ammunition or different weapon systems production. So again, I just think that this cooperation is only going to increase if to counter this influence of China.
And what about some of the countries that are NATO members and they're European countries, also members of the EU? Here, of course, I'm talking about Hungary. What about their cooperation with China? Hungarian foreign minister said that he would not like for NATO to become an anti-China alliance and that Hungary will not support this. So how do you view that?
I think this is a very interesting point because yes, on one hand we have Hungary that is opposed to China being called out by NATO, and of course NATO's treatment vis-a-vis Russia. Hungary is opposed to both, and the fact that that China was so openly called out in that communiqué is quite interesting because the world is so incredibly reliant on China's products, China's goods, given how interconnected global markets are. We are so reliant on China's products. So if China really wanted to punish the Western world, including NATO, they could very easily do that.
You mentioned earlier that there's going to most likely be more emphasis put in the Indo-Pacific region as a response to a growing Chinese threat. And of course, we do see some action already being taken with this NATO ally members. However, do you think that would result in having to kind of juggle the distribution of the resources, the NATO ammunitions, and deploying the troops to that region? Will it actually subtract from what can be supplied to Ukraine as a result?
I think any transfer of weapons is very unlikely. Again, I think mainly this will result in more interoperability that NATO will try to achieve with these states and more drills and exercises. But they're very unlikely to transfer any kind of weapons to these states. China would see that as an act of hostility. So whilst this communiqué was quite forceful in its language, any more actions on the ground would not be perceived very well by the Chinese regime.
So speaking about the communiqué, let's go back to Ukraine. I wanted to know how do you view the result and what has been stated in the communiqué that Ukraine is on an irreversible path towards membership, but there was no invitation, right? Of course. So what is your take on that?
Positive, overwhelmingly very positive. All of that is very good news for Ukraine. I'm very much aware that last year President Zelensky was very disappointed by the lack of invitation to join NATO at that point. He was very much frustrated. And I believe that NATO was trying to avoid that kind of situation this year as well. So they, again, emphasized, just like they did last year, that Ukraine's place, Ukraine's future is indeed in NATO. But if you look at requirements for joining the alliance, there are several requirements, and one of the most defining ones is that you cannot have any kind of territorial disputes. You cannot be involved in a conflict, which by definition excludes Ukraine. So Ukraine, realistically, they could not have hoped for that kind of outcome, being invited to join the alliance at this moment in time. So just pledging this further support and promising to Ukraine that they will become a member of the alliance in the future once the conflict with Russia is over, that was their best shot.
However, I felt like the hope was there, a little bit of hope at least. Veronika Poniscjakova, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.